Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. Feels like a little bit of a while since we've done this, JM. What's
Yeah,
been going on?
I don't think so much longer than before. It's just been, I think time has slowed because of all that's going on.
Yeah, I know. There's only so much you can do in the flat, isn't it?
You'd be
That's
surprised.
why like because in this particular time, it's so handy to have a hobby like writing, reading, things like that.
Yeah,
Because
wonderful
you never
things you can
bored.
do all by yourself, stuck in your own head. Just
Yeah.
don't go too far.
I know. And one of the great things as well, it's been so refreshing to see like a massive increase in people reading books. Like we're talking like 20-25% jump in book sales.
Oh, really? I
Um,
haven't heard that.
uh, yeah.
That's good news.
So I mean, if any writers listening, get your books out there on special offer. Take advantage of it. Get the because when things go back to normal, I don't know whether anyone's going to carry on reading or whether it's just going to go back to Netflix binges. Because
Yeah,
when you get home from
everybody's
work and you can't be
all the
bothered.
video of the folks at the beach today. I didn't see anybody with a book.
I know. Yeah. So, but as well, a lot of people have started writing as well. Like, there's been a massive increase in the number of people sending novels to agents and publishers. So, people are finding the time to do things that they've always wanted to do, and reading and writing's up
Yeah.
there. So, I thought this episode we both agreed, didn't we, that writing rules or so-called writing rules would be a good topic to tackle.
Yeah, and I think this one will not be as scripted as some of our past ones. We're just going to kind of organically talk through a couple of the common quote unquote writing rules, what we agree with and what we disagree with.
Yeah, it seems quite strange talking about rules when it comes to something so inherently creative, which is like it's the whole point of like creativity is to have freedom to explore. So to be constrained by rules seems a bit counterproductive.
There's a fine line between creativity and expectation. And I think that the rules come from not not limiting your creativity, but the reader's expectation and what English readers are expecting to see and what they're comfortable with. Because if you, yeah, by all means, you can break the rules and you can do weird things with your prose, but the more creative you get with your actual text, the visualness of your text, the more chance you have of turning off your readers.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like the form, like people play around with the form so much, the traditional form. I mean, I don't know if it's reached you over in South Korea there, but have you heard of Normal People by Sally Rooney?
Not offhand, no.
No, well, it's taken everything. It's like you call it the 50 Shades of Sligo, so like 50 Shades of Grey kind of thing. But it's the novel itself is it's a brilliant book by an Irish writer called Sally Rooney, and she doesn't use like speech marks or she really does play around with dialogue and form, and it won all kinds of awards,
Yeah,
and
I
that
mean,
seems to be getting the more like the novels that do challenge the traditional form do seem to be winning the awards and getting a lot of the attention. There was another book there called The Essex Serpent, about came out a couple of years ago, and it's just one long sentence. The author just uses commas throughout, and it's strange, but I don't
yeah,
know.
I mean, literary authors manipulating form has been a thing for the longest time, but that I mean that works for literary authors. The people listening to this podcast are probably not literary authors. We're all genre authors, and we're a little bit more confined by our market and our audience who are expecting something straightforward. So yeah, if you want to write a literary novel in order to win awards and not necessarily sell books, yeah, you can write a book that's a one entire sentence with commas, but
Yeah.
that's not going to work for a fantasy novel. So that's kind of the fine line that we have to walk, is that we have a specific audience expectation in genre fiction that literature, big L literature, doesn't have that same expectation, because their expectation is actually that they are going to mess with form and convention.
Do you reckon fantasy will change though in that regard with its growing popularity? John, and things like Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, like are massively commercial.
I don't
Might
know. I
draw
don't know
new
if
readers
form.
to the genre.
I don't know if form is going to change so much. I mean, definitely content and theme and ideas. Form has changed a bit. I mean, you have a mess of different types of formats, like epistolary books and books that use footnotes. Speaking of which, my current work in progress is both of those. Um,
Interesting.
some manipulation of form and format, but at the end of the day, the readers are coming to a fantasy novel for a story and a concept and a character, rather than looking at the structure of the text.
Yeah. It would be, I mean, obviously in an ideal world, it would be nice to manipulate the form. It's in a unique way that enhances the text as well. I mean,
I,
what we've done with the epigraphs, I mean, epigraphs aren't a common thing in books, and I quite like. I mean, I think Brandon Sanderson uses them in Mistborn,
mhm.
and I like them in that. And when I was talking to you about it, I thought, yeah, let's do that as well. And what we've done is tell a different story related to the novel, the main story of the novel, in the form of an epigraph, and that enhances it. It gives you a different perspective and a little bit more to build the picture of the overall story. I don't know. I thought we did it in a good way.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
when I came up with doing the epigraphs for all of the Of Metal and Magic stuff, uh, it was, the idea was a meta story that connects all of the different series and different novels that all of our authors are writing, are going to get kind of meshed together and interact through these little epigraphs that come at the beginning of each episode. But in addition, it's a universe-wide meta story that syncs all of the authors' different works together. But it also, yeah, like you said, it creates a parallel story to the book, the specific book that those epigraphs are coming in. And with my work in progress, The Fierce, I've kind of been messing with that idea a lot more. So the way that my book is currently structured, it kind of has 4 different layers. So each episode begins with a letter written by a sociologist who's who's studying one of the Plains tribes who have ancient roots. And then the second layer is the kind of the dawn of time period, where he is translating a oral history of a legendary figure, kind of like a Genghis Khan, Hercules type figure.
yeah,
And the third layer is, in between those two time frames, he's referencing historical documents that fall in between to kind of fill in the gaps of the narrative. And then the fourth layer is, in the myth. The myth has, and this is something that I've just introduced, the myth has a bunch of parables that the characters are telling these parable stories to kind of convey their kind of moral philosophy. So you see that a lot in like the Greek myths and in uh, things like Arabian Nights, which is, I just finished the Arabian Nights. So kind of borrowing that concept. So you have 4
yeah,
different kind of temporal layers, all overlapped different types of text being interacted with, and it's all being kind of meshed together by the point of view of the modern scholar. So there's footnotes as he's analyzing and annotating these different texts and different layers. It's very academic. It's
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, even within fantasy, you can do some structural stuff, but it's still trying to be one cohesive kind of narrative. Well, two parallel narratives. Um,
Yeah. Are you gonna try and make a new subgenre there then, academic fantasy?
I think I would call it epistolary still, even though it's not
Nice.
all letters. It is all secondary text. So
Yeah. So I think when we think about writing rules, there's always, I don't know about you, but when I started out, you'd always like, I need to get better. So I Google how do you improve? How do you improve your writing? How do you become a better writer? And you always ended up on those do's and don'ts lists. What you know what I'm talking about anyway.
yeah,
And the more
don't.
experience
Top
I've
10
got,
don'ts in writing. Don't, and
yeah,
they're
th-
absolutist in their certainty.
yeah. I think it's just misguided, really. I mean, obviously they just want you to help you become a better writer, but it can be counterproductive because I know so many writers who've followed these rules or tried to follow them and then run into massive conflicts within the writing or contradictions, and it just causes them frustration. It's like, well, I've been told never to do this, but this particular part of my story would be better if it went against that. But this is partly is I don't know, it just causes frustration and confusion, and
I
it's
think the
unnecessary.
rules are useful. I think so your basic list of common writing rules, which are things like show don't tell, avoid adjectives and adverbs, don't use the passive voice, don't info dump, and all those types of writing rules. That's like writing 101. That's the groundwork. And
Yeah,
like learning any skill, you learn kind of the a very structured kind of format first, and you have to get that down, and
yeah,
then you can start manipulating it and messing it with it and bending the rules. So I think this is the fantasy writers toolshed, so I'm assuming that most people who are tuning in here have some experience with writing. So you learn the rules first, and then you get to the step that we're going to kind of work on today, is understanding the nuance of some of these rules. When should what are the right and left limits, as we say in the military? um,
yeah,
uh, when do you follow it, and when can you modify it, when can you break it? In writing 101, they're just going to give you the rule because they're just trying to get you to build build your writing with some sort of basic structure. They don't explain to you what the purpose of the rule is. And I think that's the problem, is a lot of people, and I've met a lot of editors who have been hard nosed about these rules, and have either sent me back comments or sent me back rejections without analyzing the usage and the reason why I was
yeah,
breaking the rules, especially like adjectives and adverbs and stuff. Um,
yeah,
you have to understand that there's a purpose to all these rules, and when you understand the purpose, then you can understand uh, how you can bend them, and when you can violate them without bothering your reader.
yeah. It's often the case is it's the knowing when to use the right one at the right time.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so on the back of this, not long ago, did a bit of research. I think it was around the time that American writer Jonathan Franzen, he had this list of top 10 writing rules or whatever, and everyone just kicked off about it. I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know if you
I remember
remember.
that.
Everyone was
There's a lot of
fuming.
hate type.
I've got one of the funniest things I think I've ever seen written. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is one of the rules. I think this is number 10. You have to love before you can be relentless. I mean, is that a 10 rules of writing, you know what I mean? It's got absolutely nothing to do with writing.
Yeah.
So that's why I think everyone kicked off. And But yeah, it was around this time I thought, well, I wonder what everyone hates, what rules the writers actually hate. So I
Yeah.
ended up getting about, well, nearly 200 responses.
So speaking of your list, what came out on top?
So passive voice, never used the passive voice. That came out on top. That had 37 votes. So it's clear that that is a pain in the ass for everyone. And it's also, I've got a guide on passive voice and active voice on my web blog, and that's one of the my most popular articles. So it is a big problem for a lot of people, and it's something that we'll discuss in more detail in a little while, won't we?
Yeah.
Also near the top, excessive use of adjectives, that had 25 votes. Linked to that, I suppose, is adverbs. That was after, that came next with 18. Never start a sentence with. I mean, that's one that I come across a lot. It's just like, well, start a sentence with whatever you want. You know what I mean? It's just ridiculous. Show, don't tell. That's always up there. Flashbacks. I mean, I see a lot of hate against flashbacks. I think they can work if you use them well. There's different ways you can use flashbacks.
It always depends, right? So for this this episode, we're going to look at just 3 of these because just for time. All right, and we're going to look at passive voice because that was your number one, and we're going to look
Yeah,
at
everyone hates passive voice.
adjectives and adverbs together because they, they're very similar. They do similar things, and they get misused in the same way. And then we'll look at show don't tell, just because this is a fantasy podcast, and show don't tell is a big fantasy issue because you have to explain things. So how do you explain things without info dumping? So show don't tell and info dumping go together.
Yeah, I think show don't tell has become quite relevant as well. I was mentioning this to you before with the way people sort of choosing to spend the sort of time with entertainment and things like that. So television and film has grown massively. So how does that affect how we write and how we deliver information? So yeah, we'll talk about that as well. So passive voice then. I think it's one I've always struggled with, and it probably comes down to the fact that the way I talk and the way people from Liverpool talk is a lot of the words we use are passive. So we generally use like a lot of was's and stuff like that, where things like that. So for me, it's always been quite natural. And when I was writing, I was getting feedback saying, "Oh, it's too much passive voice." So I was like, "What's passive voice? This is normal. This is the way I talk." So it took me a while to get over it. I think it's becoming more common in the way we talk. We use a lot of passive words generally, day-to-day language. So I think that's why a lot of people are struggling with it. I mean, they've got a few comments here. When I did this poll, I took comments from people as well. So I'll read a couple out, which summarize quite nicely people's attitude towards passive voice. This is one's from Annie Davison. She said, "Passive voice, I hate the generic, never use passive voice advice. It's such bull. Passive voice has a place. It's just plain lazy to simply avoid it rather than learn it. It's a tool like any other." So that's what we were saying before. Yeah, that summarizes it quite nicely. I mean, it isn't that straightforward, I don't think, to understand. What do you think? Do you reckon were you okay getting your head around it?
Why don't we start? Why don't you explain what passive voice is, just to lay down the groundwork?
Yeah. So passive voice is generally sentence written in the passive voice is one in which the action is being done to the subject of the sentence. So generally, prose written in active voice is more immediate and immersive because when it comes to active voice, uh, the subject of the sentence is performing the verb, is carrying out the action. So the action is usually received by an object which comes after the action in the sentence's construction. So, for example, Layla knocked the arrow. So Layla is the subject, knocked is the verb, and the arrow is the object. So the passive version of that would be the arrow was knocked by Layla. So Layla knocked the arrow. The arrow was knocked by Layla. What do you reckon sounds better, just from a sound perspective of how it sounds? What do you think there, JM, between them
Yeah,
two?
so I mean, the active voice, Layla knocked the arrow, sounds better. And I think that comes from, general structure of English. English as a language is a subject, verb, object, sentence structure. So that's what we're used to. And when you change the grammatical structure around of the sentence, it maybe it requires a little bit more brain power to figure it out and to comprehend what's being said. So that's probably why active voice is a little bit more immediate, faster, smoother. Um,
Yeah, it grabs you as well. Like when you're
yeah.
reading it, it seems like a subtle thing, and it is quite subtle, but it has a massive effect on the prose generally. And it's publishers and the like generally prefer stories written in active voice. If your prose has got a lot of passive voice and you send it to an editor, generally they'll come back and say ditch the passive voice.
We call
So
it.
William Strunk Jr.
Yeah.
It gets referred to as quite often when it comes to discussions of rules of writing, and he talks about passive voice in that. And even Strunk says this rule does not, of course, mean that the writer should entirely disregard the passive voice, which is frequently convenient and sometimes necessary. So
Does he
when would
explain why it's necessary though?
yeah, well, this is what we're going to do now. We're going to
Okay.
explain. He's quite vague, Strunk. I mean, the book is like a pamphlet. To be honest, it's not really a book. It's very short. And it doesn't really go into much detail. But that's why we're here, JM, to
Mm-hmm.
plug the gaps. And then if you do come across situations where you have got a lot of passive voices, examples of passive voice in your text, there are a few quick ways to fix it. So one thing as a starting point, it's not always a hard and fast rule, but I always look out for certain words in sentences which could sort of suggest it might be passive. So I don't know if you're familiar with these, JM, but we've got been, am, be, are, was, to be, where, is, are, or being. So if sentences contain them words, there's a chance they might be passive. So just have a look out. And then,
So interestingly, most of those words that you mentioned, so be, was, being, those are all what we call the copula verb. So the way that the be verb works in English is it's comparing two things. So A was B means, A equals B. So when you're using when you're using the passive voice, instead of having an action verb where an action is going on, when you're using the passive voice, the subject noun of the sentence is basically just being compared to something else. So
yeah,
the man was tall versus the man was punched by Bill. They're both doing the same grammatical function. They're just comparing the subject of that verb with a state of being. It's just the man was punched by Bill. That state of being incorporates an action, and you can change that by focusing instead of focusing on the state of being, you can focus on the actual action, and you can say Bill punched the man, and
yeah,
then you have an action sentence that just has more oomph. So that's
yeah,
why a lot of your linking the linking verbs that you've listed are they're all be verbs for the most part, right? Be, was, to be, being. Um, they all do the same function.
yeah, yeah. So there you have it.
So I think what most people get wrong about the passive voice is they don't understand um, what's the fundamental difference between an active voice sentence and a passive voice sentence. Um, what's the difference between the man was punched by Bill and Bill punched the man? Um,
Yeah,
those who have been had the no passive voice rule drilled into them will say, well, it's obvious. One is active and one is passive. One has an action verb and one has a be verb. But that's not the only difference. The fundamental difference between those two sentences is the the grammatical subject of that sentence, the noun that is starting that sentence, the focus of that sentence. And that's where the nuance with passive voice comes in, at least for me. When thinking of the type of sentence, active or passive, that you want to use, it's important to remember and to focus on what the focus of the sentence and what the focus of the paragraph is. If you're only using active voice, then your sentence subjects are going to jump around sporadically
Yeah.
instead of maintaining focus on one particular noun, one particular object. So I posted on my blog a while ago an example. So first I'm going to read a quick paragraph that is written with passive voice, and then I'm going to read the alternative of taking out the passive voice.
Okay.
An arrow shot out from the slit in the wall like a bolt of lightning. It was spun around by the wind, hissing as it went. But suddenly it was snatched out of the air by a hound and delivered unceremoniously to its intended target. The lost arrow was broken in twain and left on the ground. So what is the focus of that paragraph?
The arrow.
The arrow. I'm focused on what's happening to the arrow, right? Now, if I change that, and of course, this is just something that I wrote for the moment without thinking too much about it. So it's just an example. But if I change that example to completely active tense, here's what happens. An arrow shot out from the slit in the wall like a bolt of lightning. The wind spun it around, making it hiss. A hound caught it and delivered it unceremoniously to its target. A man broke the shaft in two and dropped it on the ground. So what's the difference between that sentence or that paragraph and the passive voice paragraph? In this new paragraph, I now have 4 subjects doing different things instead of focusing just on the arrow and what's happening to the arrow. And it's going to be confusing to the reader because all of a sudden in 4 sentences, I have a new subject, a new noun that's coming up and doing things instead of just focusing on that moment and focusing on that one object that I want to focus on. So that's to me, the fundamental difference between passive and active voice. It's what are you focusing on? What is the subject, the focus point of that paragraph supposed to be? And if you're trying to zoom in on one particular object, then you're going to need passive voice because otherwise you're going to have to inject a whole bunch of new acting subjects to keep your active voice. That's to me the fundamental difference between active and passive voice is what are you talking about?
Nice. Oh, that's a cracking explanation. There you are, folks.
So next we're going to move on to adjectives and adverbs, and
This was one that I think I struggled with again when I first started writing. So adjectives and adverbs, always one that crops up. Stephen King, in his book on writing, he harps on a good bit about adverbs, but then when you read one of Stephen King's novels, you find them listed with adverbs. So
do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, so take that as you will. But I think what I've found with adjectives and adverbs, it's how and when you use them. So you can't just constantly use adverbs because the problem is they do jar the flow. And when you read that text aloud, you can hear it. It just doesn't sound good. And so it's all about using them in the right way. So I find when you're describing things like castles or landscapes or battle scenes and things like that, you can't not use adjectives, but it's not about having like sort of free reign to use whatever adjective you want and however many you want. You've got to use the right one that captures the image you're trying to portray. And same for adverbs. I mean, sometimes an adverb just works better than any other with any other words. And I find as well when you're using adjectives and adverbs, sometimes you save on words as well. So if you're short stories, for example, if you've got a tight word count, you can use an adverb, cut 2 or 3 words out. So again, it's just all down to the situation. What's your experience, JM?
So, yeah, my my fundamental writing rule, and I think this kind of encompasses I think you can loop in most of these writing rules into one thing: efficiency. Efficiency is key, and especially for someone with a flash fiction background, um, you want to do the maximum amount of storytelling in the fewest amount of words. So with adjectives and especially adverbs, a lot of times it comes to word choice. For example, especially with adverbs, something like, James ran quickly through the forest. You can replace ran quickly with a whole variety of single word verbs: sprinted, bounded, uh,
Hurried.
um,
Scurried, hurried.
hurried, yeah, um, or you know, Nick crouched and walked quietly through the library. Nick snuck through the library, crept through the library. Those two verbs kind of imply both crouching and moving slowly. So a lot of it comes down to efficiency. For adjectives, um, it's more, so there can be efficiency in adjectives. For example, if you're describing a castle wall and you say it was hard and stable wall, you could just say firm. The wall was firm.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is considering just what amount of information you need to convey to your reader.
Yeah.
Sometimes excessive detail is just not necessary. Like if I tell you there's a castle wall, I probably don't have to tell you it's hard. That's
Yeah.
implied, right? So there's a lot of
Rocks are
information
hard.
that's implied by just the nature of things. A wall is hard. Um, a person is squishy. Uh, someone who is uh, slim is probably going to be also nimble. Um, so there's a
Yeah.
lot of, you have to go through and figure out what is implied by the words I'm using, which negate the need for a lot of the adjectives and a lot of the description.
Yeah. I find as well sometimes a verb can replace the adjective and do a better job.
Yes.
So one example I always think is quite illustrative is say James was tall. Would say James loomed above everybody else.
Yeah,
And
that's a good one.
loomed
Yeah.
is a verb. So yeah, have a little think about verbs as well. And yeah, verb is always preferable to an adjective.
That-
Um,
For in my, I don't know. I've had some bad experience with adverbs and uh, adjectives and adverbs. Editors seem to be there's a lot of editors that just seem to be obsessed with uh, this rule of don't use adverbs and adjectives. I had one flash fiction piece rejected, and the uh, the editor's comments were there were too many ly adverbs in the text. So it was in 1,000 word story. There were eight.
oh my god.
There were eight ly adverbs, and going through them, I think there was two that I could have cut, but uh, two or three of them were like the wolf rose slowly. What single word verb can you use to swap out rose slowly? What verb is there that means rose slowly?
It's flash fiction.
Yeah, but
You shouldn't be editing flash fiction.
there
I
isn't
mean,
there isn't
that's
a
less than
word.
1%. That's less than one
Yeah,
percent of the word count,
but
isn't it?
but it's just not thinking through when you're highlighting your adjectives and adverbs. Part of what you're doing is to see if there's a way to replace that language to something more efficient. But there's sometimes there's just no replacing an adverb. There's no alternative verb for rise slowly.
Yeah.
That's the only way you can convey that meaning, that someone got up from the ground slowly, is to say he rose slowly. There's no alternate verb. There's no sprint or creep or loom in that case. In that case, you have to have the adverb to convey the meaning. So that's kind of where the rule dies, is there's some meanings that you don't convert into more efficient forms. So as you're going through and you're highlighting the adverbs and adjectives in your text, the thing you want to have in the back of your mind is there another way of saying this that's more efficient? And if there is, make the change. But if there isn't, by all means, keep the adjective.
Solid advice. Let's move on to the third and final one, show v tell.
Yeah, show don't tell is a big one, especially for fantasy and science fiction, genre fiction in general, just because anytime you're world building, you have a lot of information to convey. So how do you do that? So the ancient wisdom is show don't tell, right?
Yeah.
Telling being info dumping, where the narrator is relaying the information. It's not coming out through the action or through the behavior of the characters. It's a problem in all writing. It appears in all writing, and it might be something as simple as describing emotion. It comes up a lot in describing emotion, right? So
Yeah.
like James was angry is a telling statement. I am telling you that James was angry. I can show that by saying James clenched his fist.
Yeah.
And now I have an action. So not only do I have an action, I have a action that's showing me something about this character, right? So when James gets angry, he clenches his fist. It's something that he does. It's characteristic to him. I've described the character. I've given you some action. I've created some tension because, okay, he's angry and he's clenching his fist. What's going to happen now? Is he going to punch somebody? Whereas if I just say James is angry, I don't give you anything.
I think psychologically as well, for the reader, you engage with it more because you're like, well, you're trying to read that character's emotions. It's like when you're interacting with people in reality, you read in the facial expressions, the body language. It's how we interact with people visually. It's just it would be boring if we just had everyone just said, "Oh, I'm pissed off. Just leave me alone." You know what I mean? So
Yes.
we read into things, and again, as a reader, that's what you want. You want to be able to engage and draw your own conclusions, fill in the gaps, and
I
that makes
think
it
I
more
think in
interesting.
fantasy writing you kind of have two parallel show don't tell issues, and one is with world building and one is with just kind of general narrative. All writers, like the general narrative show don't tell rule kind of concept applies to all writers, and it's like the example that I just gave, showing emotion, but also something like um, James realized his friend wasn't telling the truth. You can show realization through an action, right? Like James bit his lip, or James his eyes went wide, or something like that. So thinking and emotion, you can show that instead of telling it, but it's our habit. I think it's our habit to tell, just because telling is more direct and quick. Um,
Yeah,
but it's not as exciting and insightful for the reader. And then the bigger issue with fantasy writing is you get world building, and you get info dumping. So um, how do you show versus tell your world building? That's a big problem, and it really depends on what it is. But for example, showing that a character is, say, a member of some sort of special organization. Um, you want to convey that this character is some sort of a knight of a old order, right? How do you do that? Well, you can go off on an info dump saying that the Order of the Griffin was formed 500 years ago, and Their armor, their symbol is the griffin, and it adorns their armor, and they carry long swords, and they wear plate mail, and you can just kind of dump all this information out. Or you could say something like, you know, Rowan's aged plate mail creaked, and he ran his hand across the golden griffin that was carved into the metal. So by
Yeah.
kind of having that visual image of him, feeling his armor, and conveying that the armor is aged, and then highlighting the kind of central image of that armor, you're conveying that it's a uniform, it's old, and the griffin is key to it. And you're conveying a lot of that same information. You're not getting the exact age of the order, but you are conveying that that guy, he belongs to some sort of a group, and there's some sort of it's old to some extent because his uniform is old, and it has something to do with griffins. And you're conveying a lot of that information just by showing an image, as opposed to just narrating.
Yeah. I think we are in a visual age now, with like the likes of TV, film, YouTube, Netflix. Everything is visual based, and with telling, it doesn't create the visual images that people enjoy and crave. And when we show a story through the likes of actions, we're talking about world building. So how we reveal a world, we show it through um, visual in a visual way, naturally through the narrative, by a character sort of, he could be dueling with someone else, and then as the blade of his enemy is nicking against his old armor, we're revealing a bit more about, say, his emblem gets chipped and things like that. So we're revealing details in a visual way rather than
Yeah,
just
this guy's
telling
been
them
in a
in a
fight
boring
before.
or bland way. We've got to create, it's the job of the writer more than ever now, to create visual images in the reader's mind, and showing a story is a good way of achieving that.
And same thing with like reviewing culture and reviewing points of view. I just watched the Fellowship of the Ring again, and I don't I don't think they ever really fully describe like the dwarves. And like the dwarves are this ancient
Yeah,
proud race that are, they're really kind of proud and almost to the point of being arrogant. But you get to the point where Gimli says, "Nobody tosses a dwarf," and
yeah,
you get that in one line. You get that, okay, these guys are proud of themselves. They're stubborn. They're like, you get so much cultural insight just from that one line. That's show not tell. The
yeah,
difference between a paragraph of exposition versus a one line in dialogue. And like you said, yeah, it comes from visual medium. I think film and TV uh, have kind of developed our habit of digesting story. And one thing you see a lot now that comes from TV and film is the use of dialogue for world building and for telling.
yeah,
So instead of having uh, a block of exposition where the narrator is just telling you the history, um, you have some of that revealed in the dialogue exchange between the characters. Like the problem, so the problem these days is that that almost has become the default telling mechanism. Is I'm absolutely not going to have any exposition, so I'm just going to find a way to shoehorn it into dialogue, even though it doesn't make sense.
yeah,
So you want to be careful with telling through dialogue to not have the dialogue become unnatural just to force
yeah,
in your world building.
yeah. So you always see it in like really low budget films. So like the scripts being hashed together, and there's just like a really load of obvious tell info dumping within dialogue. I mean, with films and TV, it's difficult. Like you've got to use dialogue to dump a load of information unless you use some sort of narrator. But yeah, it's just so cringeworthy when you see it. Like, so you do need to spend a bit of time thinking of ways to naturally introduce the detail. and show the detail, reveal the world. Otherwise, readers just to get really annoyed, I find, when you just obviously dump it all in front of them.
But that's not to say never tell. It's
Yeah.
just you got to know when to do it, right? And don't info dump in your first chapter of a new fantasy work. Just don't do it. Like too many fantasy writers want to dump all the detail at the beginning, and you're just slogging your reader. You can do some exposition and some telling, but do it later on. Do it when there's a pause in an actual pause in the action. Um, there's places for it, and there's ways to do it. But always, as with any of these rules, always it's important to question your use of adjectives, question your use of passive voice, question your use of telling. Is this the right way to do it? And if you come up with the answer, yes, this is going to be the best way for me to do it, then by all means, go ahead and do it.
Yeah, definitely. As long as you're engaging with it critically, like I say, asking them questions, making sure that you're justifying your usage of these things, then you can't go wrong, really. So hopefully our little rambling conversation there has been of some use to you. I think the main thing to take away from what we've been saying is don't pay attention to people who say never do this, never do that. Understand the rule and then see how it works for you. What do you think, JM? How would you summarize?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I would go further and I would say understand the guideline, because that's what these rules are not rules. They're not firm rules that you can't break. They're guidelines.
Yeah,
In a basic common situation, you should not use passive voice. That doesn't mean don't use passive voice. It just means the guideline is, generally speaking, avoid passive voice. Generally
yeah,
speaking, avoid too many adjectives and adverbs. Generally speaking, avoid telling versus showing. But they're guidelines, and there's times when you're going to break it because the alternative is what works better for your prose at the moment.
definitely.
Oh, and speaking of prose, I do have a little bit of publishing news. My
Nice.
novella, my fantasy novella, Dangerous Games, which was originally published in episodic format by Altered Reality magazine, is finally going to be up on Amazon here soon. Hopefully, by the time this podcast is posted, you'll be able to purchase an ebook copy of my novella, Dangerous Games, which is it's almost a direct prequel to my short story novel, In the Valley of Magic. So more to follow on that, but hopefully I'll be able to leave a link with this podcast on YouTube.
Nice. Congratulations, man, as well.
There you go.
Another book out there.
Keep
How many
grinding.
is that
Keep
now?
grinding. What's that?
How many books is that now?
At least 6, I think.
Nice. Flying.
Yeah, I try.
And in a few months' time as well, we'll have our novels out for Of Metal and Magic.
Yep. Late summer, early fall, we're looking to start our publishing push for Of Metal and Magic, which is going to be all of the collaborative authors going to start releasing their first books in their respective series. So should have 5 or 6 new Of Metal and Magic volumes coming out towards the end of the year, which is going to be exciting.
Yeah, including my own. Just doing the last read through now, halfway through. Starting to get a bit apprehensive, but I think it's a good story. So we'll see how we
It's
get on.
really going to be interesting to see our storyverse finally out there in the wild with all the different texts that are all related to each other, and to see how readers pick that up. And then,
Yeah,
speaking of which, when we start marketing our Of Metal and Magic releases, I'm going to build a website, and I'm looking for short fiction and fan fiction related to our storyverse. So if there's any writers out there that are looking for a venue, look me up, and you want to dive into our world and write a little piece for our shared universe to publish on our website, I'm looking for a few contributors.
Yeah, definitely, and that might lead to other opportunities with Publisher Fiction Vortex as well.
Yeah.
So, never know, guys. All right then. Well, it's been great chatting with you again, JM. I think you're all safe and well over there in South Korea now. You're out of lockdown, are you?
Oh yeah, I just went to a coffee shop yesterday. It was
Oh my
amazing.
God. That sounds like a heinous act where I'm from. How dare you leave the house?
I did get a little paranoid though because when I first got there, meeting with some friends, it was empty, and then by mid-afternoon, it was packed, and I was like, okay, now there's too many people, and they are too close to me. I need to get out of here.
Yeah, get your hazmat suit back on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, stay safe anyway.
Yeah, you too.
And stay safe, everyone else out there as well. Keep up whatever you're doing in isolation. Just grim times for everyone, but
Good
we'll
time to
get
get the
through it.
writing in. Keep up with the
Yeah,
writing.
definitely, yeah. So as always, please spread the word about this podcast. Anyone you know you think would appreciate it, just tell them about it. Give it a share, give it a like, give it a subscribe. You know
Comment
the
on
rest.
YouTube, comment on Facebook. We want to hear from you. If you got questions, let
Yeah,
us know.
definitely. Like, we're open to tackling any subject, so just let us know what you want us to do, and we'll do it. So on that note, goodbye from me.
Yep, and see you next time.
Bye bye.